Welcome back, everyone, to Crash Course Apologetics. I'm very excited because we have a very special guest today. For the past year, I have been making videos on this book, Taking Pascal's Wager. And the book is divided into 3 sections. I have made all the videos on the first 2 sections, except one. I still have one left. I wanted to get it in before today. That one is on the resurrection. It will be released soon. I'm getting close. So my guest, though, what's excited me so much, my guest is Dr. Michael Rhoda himself, and he is going to wrap this whole discussion up by summarizing the 3rd section of the book for us. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. Let me bring him in. Hey, Dr. Rhoda. Now everyone can see you. Dr. Rhoda,
Hi.
just tell us a little bit of, before we get into the discussion of the 3rd section of this book, will you just take maybe a minute, tell us a little bit about how you got into philosophy, maybe how you became so interested in Pascal's wager, and what prompted you to write the book.
Sure. I first got interested in philosophy because of conversations with atheist friends of mine who wondered if there were any good arguments for the existence of God. And at the time they first asked me, I didn't know, and I thought that's a good question. And so I became interested in arguments that were from reason alone, that could appeal to someone who wasn't sort of already on board with religion. Whereas I was by that time in college, mainly because of religious experience and an intuitive sense of God's presence. But I couldn't just give that to my friends. So I started reading philosophy. And one of the books I found early on, which I liked very much, was a little book by Peter Kraft that includes sections on, for example, the cosmological argument and on Pascal's wager. And I was taking a game theory course at Stanford in the economics department, taught by a famous economist. And I remember going to his office hours after having been in the course for a while and saying, I think that committing to God might be a rational strategy. I mean, it looks like it weakly dominates in the language of decision theory. That is to say, it might really be to your benefit and to the good, and it's not really going to hurt you. And he thought that sounded right. But he said, why not just wait till the end of your life to convert?
Mm-hmm.
And I thought about that later, and it was only later that occurred to me, well, first of all, you don't know when the end of your life will be. So it's a risky strategy to wait. And then more fundamentally, there are many benefits in this life to religious commitment, benefits that come from belonging to a religious community and having the sort of hope that Christian faith can bring. So you would lose those as well. Anyway, I got interested in those topics through my friendships.
Awesome. And when did you start writing this book? Like, did you take any time off from teaching? Like, did you take a sabbatical or anything? Or did you do this while in between semesters, maybe?
Yeah, I can't remember exactly when I started it, but there was certainly a sabbatical semester there where I made a little progress, and just summers and, during the school year, we typically have a little time for research. The reason I wanted to write the book was this. I teach to students of all views, students of all persuasions, but occasionally I'll have a student come to my office once in a long while who is interested in theism or interested in Christianity more particularly, but they're not sure if it's true. They're not sure if it's worth committing their lives to. And I wanted a book to be able to give to such a student. I often suggested C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, which is a great book, and I still recommend it. But it only has one argument for God in it, and it's the moral argument, which is a decent argument. But I think there are other arguments that are stronger, and certainly when you put other arguments together with the moral argument, you get a much stronger cumulative case. So I wanted to write a book for such a student that covered ground that wasn't covered in Mere Christianity.
I think you succeeded, and I know that Dr. Andrew Moon is watching right now, and he has used this book in his classes, and he's actually told me he's watched all my videos and so that summarizes the book, and he thought that the summaries were a good reflection. So I'm really glad that you wrote this, and I'm really excited that I got to help everyone else get their hands on the book, or at least recommend it highly to them. So let's jump into the discussion today. I'm not going to be making any videos on the third section of the book. Will you take maybe just 1 minute and explain what were you doing in the first 2 sections, and then how does this third section contribute to your overall goal?
Right. So the goal of the first 2 sections is to argue that it's rational to commit to living a Christian life. And that argument is structured as a modus ponens argument, something like this. If there's at least a 50% chance that Christianity is true, then it's rational to commit your life to living a Christian life. First, that's the first premise, and that's what Pascal's wager supports. Then the second premise is, and there is at least a 50% chance that Christianity is true, and that's what I try to argue for in part 2. But suppose you read all that and you were like, yeah, I agree with that. This looks rational. Doesn't mean you're going to do it, because there are a lot of things that we know we should do that we might not do for a variety of reasons. It's sometimes said that the longest distance in the world is from the head to the heart. So what I wanted to do in the third part was appeal to the heart by showing how a Christian life can be a beautiful and noble thing. And so by trying to move the will and not just the intellect.
Great. And in that third section, you tell us about 3 individuals. And I wanted to give you the opportunity to briefly summarize the stories that you tell about each of those 3 individuals. So would you like to start with Dietrich Bonhoeffer?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll just sort of tell this story as best as I can. And if you think I'm starting to go too long,
yeah, take your time. Take your time. I'll let you know.
Okay. So let me start with a story that gives you a sense of Bonhoeffer's personality. When he was 25, he was a recently ordained pastor in Berlin, and he was asked to take over a confirmation class in a really rough section of North Berlin. The elderly pastor who had been teaching the course just couldn't handle 50 boys who were in it. At that time, these classes were more of a state-sponsored expectation than something that the kids necessarily wanted to be involved in. It was like teaching core required philosophy classes, but even worse. No, I like my core classes. Anyway, so this elderly pastor takes Bonhoeffer, and they're going up the stairs to the classroom, and there's 50 boys hollering and yelling and throwing stuff down the stairwell as they walk up. They get to the top. The elderly pastor kind of shoves a few kids back into the classroom, introduces the new teacher, Bonhoeffer, and the students start to chant, Bon, 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 louder and louder. Just a Lord of the Flies kind of scene. The elderly pastor just like leaves in despair. And Bonhoeffer does probably the only thing he could have done to have a decent class. He walks into the classroom, puts his hand in his pockets, leans against the wall, just watches the students silently for like several minutes. They kind of lose a little steam, and then he starts talking very softly, so only people in the first row can hear him, and only a little bit. And in a minute, everyone's quiet because they want to hear what he's going to say. And it turns out he's telling a story which they're interested in. It's a story about Harlem in New York where Bonhoeffer had visited. Nothing to do with religion, but it's interesting to them. And they listen. And it doesn't go on too long, and he says, well, if you come next time and listen, I'll tell you more. Class dismissed. He never had a problem with discipline in the class again. So He ends up moving to North Berlin to an apartment so he can get to know these kids' families and them. He has them up in groups, makes them dinner, teaches them to play chess, talks about theology, and they become close. When they're actually confirmed, in the sermon, he says some interesting things. I want to read a little excerpt from that sermon. So he says, "Dear confirmation candidates, when in the last days before your confirmation, I asked you many times what you hoped to hear in your confirmation address, I often received the answer, 'We want a serious warning which we shall remember all our lives.' And I can assure you that whoever listens well today will receive a warning or two by the way. But look, life itself gives us enough and too many serious warnings today. And so today I must not make your prospect for the future seem harder than it already is. And I know that many of you know a great many of the hard facts of life. Today you are not to be given fear of life, but courage. And so today in the church, we shall speak more than ever of hope, the hope that we have and which no one can take from you." They needed hope at that time. Germany was in a severe economic depression in the early 30s. This was 1931. By 1932, unemployment was at 30%. These kids, of course, many of them would have lost their fathers in World War I, or their people they know would have died. It was a rough scene, a scene that Hitler capitalized on. And by 1934, he had total control. One of the early things the Nazis did was say, hey, if you're Jewish, what doesn't matter what you believe. If you're ethnically Jewish, you can't work in the government. And eventually that got applied to the German evangelical church, of which Bonhoeffer was a part. He was a pastor. So this was completely unbiblical and unchristian. I mean, Peter and Paul were of Jewish, Jesus was of Jewish ethnicity. It's just absurd. And many pastors realized at the time, Nazism is not Christian, and we need to oppose this. So a large section of that church broke off and formed what they called the Confessing Church, and Bonhoeffer was a part of that. They were critical of the Nazi regime, and the Nazis started cracking down in various ways, eventually arresting about 800 of the leaders of the movement, imprisoning many of them. Bonhoeffer was just a junior figure, so they interrogated him for 7 hours and let him go. Now, by this time, 1938, there's already a clandestine resistance to Hitler. In particular, the head of military intelligence for the German armed forces, so like the main spy, is himself opposed to Hitler, but nobody knows it. Well, nobody but the resistance knows it. And this guy was Admiral Canaris. One of his staff officers, Hans Dohnanyi, was married to Bonhoeffer's sister Christelle. Dohnanyi, by this time, had already documented a list of Nazi atrocities, and this was very secretive and very dangerous. But as a consequence, Bonhoeffer's immediate family, they knew more early than the average German what Hitler was really about. And Bonhoeffer's brother Klaus got involved in the resistance early on. For Bonhoeffer, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a decision came in 1939 when it was announced that men of his age would have to register for military service. So there was a draft. He didn't want to fight for the Nazis. He didn't want to be executed. And then a way out presented itself. A friend in the States, in the United States, arranged for him to get an invitation from Union Theological Seminary to teach at the seminary. And Bonhoeffer thought about it, accepted, and in June 1939, he was on a boat across the Atlantic. That could have been that. He could have escaped the Nazis. But already on the boat, he had misgivings, and he wondered whether it was cowardly of him to flee his country, his church when it needed him, his family and friends were risking their lives, and he was soon in New York City sort of being pampered at the theological seminary. So very soon he decided, no, I'm needed. I need to be in the trenches. Not the trenches of warfare with guns, but the trenches of fighting against the Nazis in the resistance and in, trying to build up the authentic church that was there. So he's back on the boat in July 1939. He gets back. But now he's still got to register for military service, right? So Hans Donani, his brother-in-law, has an idea, and it involves 2 layers of deception. So here's the idea. First, you keep working as a pastor in the confessing church, but secretly you will be in the employment of the Department of Military Intelligence in the German Armed Forces to spy for the Nazis on the confessing church. That will be the cover. But in fact, you will actually be in the resistance, resisting the Nazis. So I don't know if I explained that well, but there's 2 layers of, he's a double agent. He's not just a secret agent. He's posing as if he's on the Nazi side, but really in the resistance. So in that role, he's involved in some minor activity. He helps 14 Jews escape to neutral Switzerland. He travels to Sweden to get some information to the British. Turns out to not be very helpful to the British. And then he gets arrested in 1943. And he's in jail for about 2 years. And they don't really have good evidence for him at first. And it's looking like he may just stay in jail to the end of the war. He may be fine. Then the Valkyrie plot happens to assassinate Hitler. There's a great movie about this with Tom Cruise in it.
Yeah, worth seeing. I really like it.
Yeah. So that happens, and after Hitler survives, they round up anybody who's connected with it. 7,000 people get arrested. Canaris gets arrested. Donani's already been arrested earlier. And renewed suspicion falls on Bonhoeffer. And he gets sent to Buchenwald concentration camp, where 50,000 people were killed during the war. But he's not sent to gas chambers. He's sent with other high-profile political prisoners into a little basement, a little tiny prison in the basement of one of the buildings. And there's 16 other prisoners. And they're in their cells most of the time, but they're allowed to walk up and down the corridor every day for exercise and gets to know everybody in that group. Okay, what happens next? Canaris' diaries get discovered. They see the evidence that Bonhoeffer's involved. Hitler himself gets interested in the case. This is weeks before the end of the war. This is like April 3rd, April 1st, something like that. And in the end, Bonhoeffer is hanged on April 9th, and they burn his body. 3 weeks later, Hitler himself is dead, and the war's over. So he almost makes it. The story's got an element of tragedy to it because the bad guys win, right? He was resisting the Nazis. He didn't accomplish much. He could have been a great pastor for years. That was cut short. He died. He was engaged when he died. His fiancée was left without a husband. So it's easy to look at Bonhoeffer's life and think, okay, he went all in for Christianity and he failed. And he was martyred. But that's not how Bonhoeffer himself looked at his life. So what's interesting is the accounts of those prisoners who were with him at Buchenwald and what they say in their letters. Many of them were depressed. Bonhoeffer was cheerful. And here's some of the things they say. Bonhoeffer was different, just quite calm and normal, seemingly perfectly at ease. His soul really shone in the dark desperation of our prison. And another, Bonhoeffer was all humility and sweetness. He always seemed to diffuse an atmosphere of happiness, of joy in every smallest event in life, and of deep gratitude for the mere fact that he was alive. He was one of the very few men I have met to whom his God was real and ever close to him. So did Bonhoeffer fail? Far from it. He loved God and other people. He stood up for what was right. And when evil finally overcame him, he didn't give in to bitterness. He had courage and hope until the very end. So I look at that life, believing that Christianity is true, as I do, and I think that was a life well lived. But then I think, even if it turned out that I were wrong, even if it turned out that Bonhoeffer were wrong, and that when he died, it all went black, and that was it, would it have been better if he had fled from the Nazis? Or would it have been better, let's say, if he had not been Christian at all and just minded his own business? And I want to say no, even as I don't believe, but even if Christianity were false, he had a beautiful life, and it was because of his Christian faith and his commitment to what he thought was true. So that's my story about Bonhoeffer.
Yeah. I think that this, and all three stories will have a similar feature to them. But this is really relevant in video number 4 of the playlist and your chapter in here on objections to the wager. That's video number 4. I cover objections to the wager. And there's one objection in particular that sometimes people raise, and they just say the cost of commitment is just too high. To commit your life to Christianity, it's a huge cost. And I think that, like you're saying, when you reflect on a life like Dietrich Bonhoeffer's, and you think, well, what would have been better for him? Would it have been better if he would have just not committed his life and not stood up for what was right and so forth? And yeah, I have the same sense that you do, that no, he actually had a really significant life, and it was precisely because he did what he did at great cost. So let me see. Diane Higo, some people are watching live. Diane Higo says the cost of discipleship, no such thing as cheap grace. I've actually not read Bonhoeffer's The Cost of Discipleship. I've heard people highly recommend it. Have you spent any time reading that?
No, unfortunately not. I read a lot of biographies of Bonhoeffer and some of his correspondence, but I didn't actually read his work. A friend of mine, though, has told me it's an excellent book, The Cost of Discipleship.
Yeah. All right, well, let's move on. That's the first life, and we're at about 20 minutes. So let's move on to the second individual. And you may have to... who were we going to talk about second? Was it...
Jean Vanier.
Okay, yes. Jean Vanier. I'm glad I have you to correctly pronounce the French. I want to look at it and say Jean Vanier. But
yes.
Go ahead.
Well, I think, they say Jean Vanier, but the truth is I'm probably messing up half the words myself. But yeah, Jean Vanier's story in a way begins as Bonhoeffer's is ending. Because as the German troops swept west in 1940 into France, Vanier was an 11-year-old boy fleeing with his family, fleeing west. His father, they were Canadian, and his father was the diplomatic ambassador from representing Canada to France. And so when the troops were coming in, Vanier's mom and his family were fleeing, and they got on a boat and they went back to Canada. So then 2 years later, John surprised his father by coming into his father's office with a bunch of paperwork. And he said, "Dad, I want to join the British Navy." And he showed him the paperwork. And somehow John had found out that the Royal Navy College in England accepted cadets as young as 13. And he was 13. And he'd filled out all the paperwork. His mom was worried. And his dad said, "Hey, let's not clip this boy's wings. Who knows what he might become?" So his parents supported him, and he was accepted. And he got on a ship. I think it was a dangerous voyage at the time because of the German submarine blockade of the British Isles. They were sinking scores of ships. But Vanier's ship made it. Vanier's ship made it. And he shows up in England. First, he goes to London. I think his sister was there studying or something. And he goes to her apartment, and she's not there when he arrives. So in the evening, she and her friends come back after being out later in the evening, and they find 13-year-old Jean sleeping on her front steps, surrounded by his luggage. Then after a short visit, he goes and enrolls in the Royal Navy College. He eventually becomes an officer, serving on Canada's only aircraft carrier at the age of 20. But then he starts wanting to explore the priesthood, and his parents support him in this. And he resigns his commission and goes to France to study philosophy and theology. And he gets to know a particular Dominican priest, Father Thomas, I forget the last name. So he ends up writing a doctoral dissertation on the ethics of Aristotle. And the chair of the philosophy department at St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto reads it and says, "This is good stuff. Let's hire this guy." So in spring 1964, Jean gets invited to teach at the University of Toronto. And he's never taught much before. It turns out he's a natural, and his students just mob his classes. They're absolutely packed. He initially plans to talk about Aristotle and justice. He quickly realizes they don't want to really hear about this. They want to talk about sexuality and atheism and other topics that they were interested in. So he tosses his syllabus and he rewrites his course, and the whole campus. Well, I don't know if the whole campus, but he gives lectures that are just absolutely packed. All the faculty, tons of students are coming. So they offer him a permanent position. And at this point, you can imagine his parents being very pleased. Their son's been away for years. He's doing some soul searching. Now he's going to settle down. He's got a job at the most prestigious university in Canada. He's close to home. This is great. Nope. He says, actually, I'm not going to, thank you, I'm not going to accept the offer. I'm going to go back to France to care for 2 intellectually disabled men. And that's what I'm going to do with my life. It's not just a short-term thing. That's my path. Mm. And his mom was upset. I mean, from her point of view, it must have looked like her son was throwing away a credible career. He could reach all these students, and he's just going to care for 2 disabled guys. But Vanier sticks with it. So what had happened was this. The summer before, in 1963, he'd gone back to visit Father Thomas, who is now living in a little village in France and working in a humble position as a chaplain chaplain at an institution for intellectually disabled people. And Vanier gets to know some of them. And he's quite moved. I mean, their lives aren't easy. Let me read a little bit. So he's talking about the intellectually disabled people he gets to know that summer. Each one had so much life, had suffered so profoundly, and thirsted so deeply for friendship. Within each gesture and each word was the question, will you come back? Do you love me? Their cry of pain and their thirst for love touched me deeply. So he did come back. That's why he came back a year later. He just didn't feel teaching was his vocation, and he remembered these men, and he wanted to be of help to them. Mm. So he goes back. Father Thomas directs him suggests he go and visit various institutions that serve the disabled at the time in France. And at that time, the care is not very good. I mean, he finds one disabled teenager just chained up in a garage. That's where the guy lives. He goes to another asylum near Paris. It's designed for 40 people. It has 80 people, 80 men crammed in. And he describes it like this. Huge concrete walls surrounded the buildings made of cement block. 80 men lived in dormitories with no work. All day long, they just walked around in circles. From 2 to 4 p.m., there was a compulsory siesta, then time for a walk all together. I was struck by the screams and the atmosphere of sadness, but also by a mysterious presence of God. So he does decide to do something, and he decides to start small. And with a little help from his family, he buys a little house in the village where Father Thomas is working, a little rundown house. And he invites 3 of the people from that asylum with 80 people in it. He just invites 3 of them to come live with him. And one of them cannot hear or speak. And he just freaks out, like he cannot deal with the transition. And regretfully, they take him back. The remaining 2, what happens next is hard to describe. But Vanier builds a beautiful community with them. He finds some productive employment for the guys so that they can do something they feel is meaningful. It's like they made little toys and sold them and other handicrafts and worked in a garden. And then he fills the days with prayer and mass and other activities. But the main thing he does is they become friends. And as time goes on, he invites more disabled people to live with him, and more able volunteers come to assist him. And it grows and grows, and it becomes the movement called l'Arche, which is the French word for the Ark, as in Noah's Ark, which accepts all the different species, right? So in large communities, the intellectually disabled and abled live together over the long term, over a long period of time. So it's not just volunteers cycling in and out. It takes a commitment. And it's a beautiful thing. There are something like 150 houses now around the world.
Mm.
So if you study Vanier's life, you see that his work with the disabled helped him grow as a human being in ways he never expected when he started. And initially he thought, I'm here to serve these guys. And he ends up becoming a new person, a much better person. So let me talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Here's how he explains it. He says, the life in L'Arche taught him a way of putting people first, of entering into personal relationships. So he says, this way of approaching each individual, of relating to each one with gentleness and kindness, was not easy for me. I joined the Navy when I was very young, just 13, a highly impressionable age. All my training was geared to help me to be quick, competent, and efficient, and so I became. As a naval officer, and even later after I had left the Navy, I was a rather stiff person, geared to goals of efficiency, duty, prayer, and doing good to others, and to philosophical and theological studies. My energies were goal-oriented. From the beginning, in 1964, L'Arche has been truly a learning experience for me. It has brought me into the world of simple relationships, of fun and laughter. The life of people with intellectual disabilities is not a life centered on the mind. So it is that the people with intellectual disabilities led me from a serious world into a world of celebration, presence, and laughter, a world of the heart. Power and cleverness call forth admiration, but also a certain separation, a sense of distance. We are reminded of who we are not, of what we cannot do. On the other hand, sharing weaknesses and needs calls us together into oneness. So, living with the disabled helped Vanier overcome a very common and very natural obstacle towards moral growth, which I have a hard time putting my finger on, but I'll try my best. I think it's this. As human beings, we naturally desire status and all that brings prestige, social status. We want people to like us, to be popular. And we want the things that will bring us that: beauty, strength, intelligence, wealth, power. And it's very easy to focus on tasks and goals to pursue those things. And at the same time, to sort of neglect the close relationships around us. To take for granted old friends, kids, spouses. It becomes, after a while, maybe not as exciting as pursuing the career or chasing the next thing, right? Mm. So this is a danger. And what's more, if you value yourself because of your accomplishments, there will be parts of you that you're ashamed of, your weaknesses. You won't like to think about. You won't like to expose them to other people. And this will create a distance with other people, because if you don't share yourself with someone, there's only so close you can be. And when we're living like this, we don't even notice we're doing it. There's only so close that we let people come. And what Vanier found was that by living with the disabled, he came to accept his own weaknesses and become a much more open and relational person. And people, I've never met him in person, but people have tell me it was amazing. I mean, you really felt that you were the only person in the room when he talked to you, and he could connect with everybody. Mm. So he lived a beautiful life, and it started with his desire to follow Jesus, even though it was in a way that made no sense according to the world. I'm just going to go live with two disabled guys? What? Here's another thing he says. I'll finish on Vanier with this quote. So this is part of a speech he gave near the end of his life. When those ingrained in a culture of winning and of individual success really meet the intellectually disabled and enter into friendship with them, something amazing and wonderful happens. They too are opened up to love, and even to God. They are changed at a very deep level. They are transformed and become more fundamentally human. Let me tell you about Pauline. She came to our community in 1970, hemiplegic, epileptic, one leg and one arm paralyzed, filled with violence and rage. It was not easy to live in one of our small homes with her. Our psychiatrist gave us good insight and advice. Her violence was a cry for friendship. For so long, she had been humiliated, seen as hardly human, having no value, handicapped. What was important was that the assistants take time to be with her, listen to her, and show their appreciation for her. Little by little, she evolved and became more peaceful and responded to their love. Her violence disappeared. She didn't particularly like to work in our workshops, but she loved to sing and to dance. When she was quite a bit older, I would go and visit her. Sometimes she would put her good arm on my head and she would say, "Poor old man." It takes a long time to move from violence to tenderness. The assistants who saw her initially as a very difficult person began to discover who she was under her violence and under her disabilities. They also began to change. They discovered that for a person, growth was not primarily climbing the ladder of power and success, but learning to love people as they are. So that's my story about Vanier.
Yeah, very good, very good. So in this case, it's not like Vanier suffered what we might think of religious persecution or something like that. But there was a real cost there in the ways you described, with this successful career, admiration from his family, peers, could have been very widely known, and maybe had opportunities to teach in larger venues, larger universities, something like that. But he gave up those opportunities. So like you said, and grew morally and spiritually in ways that it sounds like might very well not have otherwise. So that's definitely an inspiring story too. All right, well, let's finish up the third individual here, and then we'll get to the audience's questions. So those watching, if you have a question about anything that Dr. Rhoda said in his book or something I've said in the video, now's the time to ask, because I have the expert on hand to clarify. So, okay, you can finish up with Ilibagiza. Is that how you say it? I might be wrong.
That's my best guess. So
Yeah.
it's Immaculée Ilibagiza.
Okay.
And she was raised in Rwanda in a large, very loving and close Catholic family. And they were caught up in the Rwandan genocide in 1994. So her story is so amazing, I really hesitate to try to do it justice in just a few minutes. So what I mainly encourage people is to check out her book, Left to Tell, which is worth reading. But I'll give you the bare bones of the story, at least some highlights. The background is that in Rwanda there are two main ethnic groups, the Hutu and the Tutsi. The Tutsi are in the minority, but in the mid-20th century, they were in positions of political power. And the German and later Belgian colonizers kind of encouraged that and strengthened the Tutsi and used them to exercise indirect rule in the colony. What was the colony? Then, as time went on and African countries became independent, in 1973, Rwanda became independent, and it was Hutus who led that. So from 1973 on through 1990 until 1994, there was a Hutu-led government. Many Tutsis fled the country and lived as refugees in Uganda, which is a neighboring country. But not Immaculée's family. They stayed and just minded their own business. Her mom was a primary school teacher. Her dad was in charge of Catholic schools in the region. They had a nice home that he designed and built. It had a cistern to catch rainwater, solar panels, so they'd have a little electricity. They had some animals, and they had a good life. And the students worked hard. The kids worked hard, and they were at various universities and jobs. Immaculée was studying in the capital. So she goes back for Easter, back home in 1994. And basically chaos ensues. The country ends up just exploding. There's this military force of Tutsis who are outside the country, and they start attacking. They're looking to regain a place to live, basically, because they're refugees in Uganda. And the Hutu government is fighting them. Then the Hutu president's plane gets shot down, and extremist elements in the Hutu government seize power and start a genocidal campaign. So not only are they fighting the Tutsi rebels coming in, they enlist civilians to kill non-combatant Tutsis within the country. So it's about as bad as you can imagine. And they have, it's a terrific story. They have a chance to escape, but they just don't think they need to. They think, there's been ethnic conflict before, and we don't need to ride this out. Immaculate's parents decide. I mean, it's like the night before everything explodes, they have a chance to escape, but they're like, we don't need to do that. So then it does go bad, and the father, Immaculate's father, says, Pastor Morenzi, see if he can help you. So he lived a few miles away. This is a Protestant pastor that the family knew. And he does hide her, along with 7 other Tutsi women, in a bathroom in his house, which is kind of hard to see that it's there. And then he covers up the door with a large wardrobe, so you can't even see the door. She's there for 3 months, 91 days. And during that time, several times, groups of killers, like large groups, come through the house, search it. They're shouting her name at one point because they know she was last seen there, right? And they're like, Immaculate, we know you're here. We're going to kill you. And she's quiet in the bathroom, right? So there's drama in her story because of the physical conflict in the country. But what's also interesting, if you read the book, is there's spiritual drama within her own soul as well. So she says, basically, she got angrier and angrier sitting in this bathroom. And the pastor who was sheltering her would occasionally give them news and updates and telling them all these horrible things that were happening. And, of course, that made her angrier and angrier. Let me read something from her book. She says, I was angrier than I'd ever been before, more than I believed was even possible. I was angry at the pastor for telling us such horrific details when our families were out there with nowhere to hide. I was angry at the government for unleashing this Holocaust. I was angry at the rich countries for not stopping the slaughter. But most of all, I was angry at the Hutus, all of them. And as the pastor droned on about the horrible things being done to Tutsis, my anger grew into a deep, burning hatred. I'd never done anything violent to anyone before, but at that moment, I wished I had a gun so that I could kill every Hutu I saw. I wanted to set the whole country on fire. If I'd had an atomic bomb, I would have dropped it on Rwanda and killed everyone in our stupid, hateful land. So then what happens next is she has difficulty praying. I mean, when she gets in the Lord's Prayer to the line that says, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against it, she knows she's not willing to forgive the killers. And she starts to feel distant from God and just feeling like she can't pray to a God of love when she's filled with hate. So she describes it as a war within her soul. I mean, she loves God, but she can't forgive. She knows God wants her to forgive. This is one of her prayers at the time, which she recounts in her book. So this is her talking to God. Why do you expect the impossible from me? How can I forgive people who are trying to kill me, people who have already slaughtered my family and friends? It isn't logical for me to forgive these killers. Let me pray for their victims instead, for those who've been raped and murdered and mutilated. Let me pray for the orphans and widows. Let me pray for justice. God, I will ask you to punish these wicked men, but I cannot forgive them. I just can't. So the story goes on, and eventually she has a powerful religious experience, which she describes in the book, which kind of opens her up to be able to forgive her killers. And she does go on. She eventually survives, escapes, flees with the pastor's help to French lines. The French came in as humanitarian, I guess, assistance, you might say. And so she survives. And afterwards, in some dramatic ways, which she describes in the book, she forgives people who were involved in the death of her family. So one of the many things that's amazing about her story is you can see first how noble it is to follow the church's, the Christian teaching on forgiveness. I mean, Jesus says forgive not 7 times, but 70 times 7 times. And you see really how hard that can be, but how beneficial it can be. Because one thing that could have happened to Immaculée very easily is the killers who took away her family could have ruined the entire rest of her life also if she'd become a bitter, habitually angry person. But with God's help, that's not what happened. So by following Christian teaching, she's able to help herself and others recover from this horrific experience.
Yeah. That ties in with two of the points you make in the book. So one of them that comes to mind is the moral beauty of Christian doctrine. There is something just so beautiful about stories of radical forgiveness. I know that Cameron Bertuzzi, he is a friend of mine. He really likes soul-building theodicies, and he uses these as illustrations a lot of the kind of soul-building that can happen when there's like a terrible tragedy, but then this individual has this incredible act of forgiveness. And I think of something like that with this story, that kind of moral beauty. But also this worldly goods. It was good for her to not grow bitter, and Christian teaching definitely, I think, aided in that process and was a benefit. So, all right. Well, before we turn to the questions, do you have any thoughts about kind of like maybe a summary of what you think all three of these individuals have in common? Because the thumbnail, the little picture with the title on it for YouTube videos, is a life of Christian commitment desirable? And so I think what I think you put in the book that yes, it is, and these three individuals I think are models of that. Do you have anything you want to add there before we go to questions?
Thank you. No, I mean, I do. You said it very well, and that is what I think. There's something about these lives and other Christian lives where you see the nobility of following Jesus. You see how it can look. And it's not a life that's easy necessarily, but it's a life that when you're done with it, you can be glad you lived it. It's a life I think many people would look at and say, yeah, that Bonhoeffer was awesome. Way to go, resisting the Nazis and being a martyr. But it's not as easy as for us to be the sort of people who do that ourselves. But I think when we meditate on noble examples, it can help us move a little closer to the ideal.
Great. All right. Well, we are going to take. Do you have like 10 or 15 minutes to answer questions? Okay.
Sure.
So we've gotten a few. Let me look back at the top here to see. I had a couple picked out. The very first one came from Dr. Andrew Moon. He asked, is there a biography of Bonhoeffer that you recommend?
Oh, so I did the research for this in like 2015. So it's 5 years ago. So I remember two. One was by Eric Metaxas, which is great and very readable. And then there was another more scholarly one that had a little more detail. I liked them both. It might have been by Eberhard Bethge, Bethge. Yes, I believe it was. So he was one of Bonhoeffer's closest friends. And that may be the authoritative biography. I can't remember.
Okay, so let me... Andrew Moon, again, asked, And I was curious about this too, and because I wrote it the way you did in the book and in the video. It's when we're talking about the many gods objection, and you put up this table, and you show three options. Obviously, the many gods objection wants to say there's infinitely many options, but or possible states of the world. So one would be Christianity's true, another would be Islam is true, and then another would be atheism's true. I think that's how the table was set up. And under the column that says Christianity, you speak of hell in a different set of terms than you do of the hell in Islam. So if this is Andrew Moon's question, that just kind of set it up. He said, do you think Christianity implies hell? Why say that Islam implies hell but Christianity doesn't? In the book, Dr. Rhoda just says it lowers the chance for eternal life. But under Islam, it says eternal misery. Is there an asymmetry here?
Good. Okay, good question. So I'll try to reply in two ways. First of all, there are different versions of Islam. Okay, so one can imagine a view on which you believe that you're Muslim and you believe that Christians will go to hell, and that view is possible. And then you can imagine other views where you don't believe that. You believe that you're Muslim, but you believe Christians can be saved. So really, if you're doing the chart, you should have a column for both of those. Okay. So and then within Christianity, there are some people who think, Christianity involves the doctrine of hell, and some people who say, well, I'm Christian, but I'm a universalist. There's no hell. So really, you'd want to lay them all out, and you could lay them all out in a matrix. Now, in terms of my own views, I do think the biblical evidence for hell is too strong to ignore. I mean, it looks to me like that's a teaching of that's one of the things Jesus taught. So I accept that. However, it doesn't. When you're drawing your little matrix, suppose Christianity is true and you don't commit to God. So suppose we're believing that if Christianity is true, there is a hell. You can be eternally separated from God if, basically, on the view I take, he's not going to save anyone against their will. Okay, so if you finally just do not want to be with God, he's going to respect that. Okay, so assume Christianity is true and there is a hell, and you didn't even try to search for God in your life. We don't want to put in the little matrix, we don't want to say, well, then you're definitely going to hell. Because we don't know that. I mean, what the matrix, when you're taking the wager, is about, it's about a decision you're going to make now at age, say you're age 40. If you decide now, I'm not interested in committing to God, I don't want to search for God, it's not guaranteed that you'll stick with that strategy. Even if you do stick with that strategy, it's not guaranteed that you'll go to hell. Maybe God will excuse you because the evidence available to you wasn't good enough, or you were subject to confusing, maybe you had enough of a reason not to be a believer that God can overlook that. So that's why I put not committing to God doesn't guarantee that you won't be with God, but it does lower the chance as compared to the strategy of committing to God, searching for God, trying to live as you think God would want you to live.
Mm-hmm. Okay. If there's time, I'll follow up with a question, but I'll move on for now. So this is another interesting one from Andrew Moon. He said, are there any ways you think arguments in your book should be updated since the time of writing it 5 years ago?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, let me think about this. So there should be more in divine hiddenness, I think. I only spend like 2 or 3 pages on it.
I don't even think you spend that. I just made the video on this topic, the counter evidence, and you give the Kierkegaard parable, and that's kind of it. That's what I was hoping. I'll probably end up making a video that's just a standalone on divine hiddenness, just because I had several people in the comments of that video be like, this was too quick. You need to go in more detail.
I think that's totally fair. Yeah. So the response to the argument from divine hiddenness in the book is weak. I still think it's a good response, but it could be a lot stronger. So others have worked on that topic. So there are things to read on that. And then there's a little bit in the cosmological argument section, which I think it could be strengthened a little bit. Let me see if I can remember off the top of my head what it was. It was something like this. Some reviewer thought I was relying on something like the principle of sufficient reason, and which says that for any contingent happening, there's got to be some explanation sufficient to explain why it happened. And in my version of the cosmological argument, I'm trying actually to not use the principle of sufficient reason, but the causal principle that any object or substance that exists must have, there must have been a cause. There must have been a cause or causes that explain why it exists rather than not. Mm-hmm. And I like that better than the principle of sufficient reason because it's easier, even if the principle of sufficient reason is true, it's harder to defend. I mean, almost everyone can agree there's got to be some reason why this cup exists, why this glass exists. It doesn't just pop into existence or exist eternally for no reason. So in my teaching, I've clarified the argument a little bit better. So it's hopefully more clear that we're not relying on the principle of sufficient reason. We don't need that to make the argument.
Yeah. One thing that I would like, so on this channel, I know you haven't gotten to watch many videos. I think you've seen the one in the playlist, but I bring on Christian philosophers, not always Christian philosophers, sometimes it's not, but and on various topics. So I've had on Josh Rasmussen to talk about the his particular version of the contingency argument. But one thing that a friend of mine, as they watched my video summarizing your chapter, they are a mereological nihilist, and so they just quickly say this whole you need an explanation for the group. There is no group. There's just these individual things. So that I don't need an explanation for this group. There's no such thing. So I didn't know do you have any kind of thoughts on that, or what would you say?
Yeah, I do. I think that's a misreading of what I'm trying to do. So when I talk about an explanation, in my version of the cosmological argument, we ask at a certain point, take the group of all the existing things and ask, why did that group exist? But you don't have to think of the group as an additional thing that we're asking about. Rather, what I'm saying is just we want an explanation of why all the individual things have existed rather than none of them having existed. So your friend who's the mereological nihilist, he still thinks there are individual things, all the atoms, I guess, or elementary simples, elementary particles. So the question for him would be, take all the individual things, don't think of them as a third thing or another thing, but just take all the individual things that have ever existed, all the individual contingent things that have ever existed, and ask, why did all those things? So this is plural quantification. We're just talking about the things plural. We don't need to aggregate them into one whole. Why did all the things exist rather than not? Because if they were each contingent, it wasn't necessary that all of them had to exist. Indeed, it wasn't even necessary that any of them had to exist. So, yeah, I think I don't think my argument assumes that there is a thing that is the whole group.
Okay, all right. Again, I could come back and clarify, but I want to get as many other questions as we can with the time. So another one. Let's see. One person has like several, and I'm trying to get them to kind of condense it down into one clear question. But Andrew Moon, let's see. Well, wait a minute. I think he was responding to this person. Okay, I'll ask Tim Saunders' question. He said, if the wager is a dead end, what if a wagering person coaches another person to do wagering acts that result in premature death? I think this has something to do with maybe like think of martyrs in mind. Like you encourage a Christian to become a missionary, and then they take their families and they all go over and they get slaughtered somewhere, and it turns out that Christianity's false. I think that, I mean, this is just part of, maybe you can, I know that in the video I made, we speak specifically of, okay, go ahead. I'm sorry. I thought he clarified.
Yeah, good. Well, this is, I think, a version of the objection. There may be really high costs here that we haven't thought about, and they may just be too high. So what if Christianity weren't true, and what if, having taken the wager yourself, you raised your kids as Christians, or you encouraged someone else to be Christian, and they went and were martyred? Isn't that like a huge negative? Well, yeah, that's a huge negative. It doesn't follow that it's not the right thing to do or the smart thing to do to take the wager. That will depend on all the goods in the equation and on how likely you think Christianity is to be true or not. So say you think it's 50-50. I mean, I think most people take the wager are going to be people who think it's more than 50, but maybe aren't certain it's true. But let's just stick with the hardest possible case, 50-50. Okay, so then what the questioner is pointing out is, hey, if you take that wager and it turns out Christianity is false, there's this huge negative here I want to tell you about. So-and-so is going to end up becoming a missionary and becoming martyr. Okay, that is a big negative. But the thing you got to remember is the negatives on the other side are even bigger, because you're thinking there's a 50% just Christianity is true. And so if you don't take the wager, there's this person over here who might end up eternally separated from God because you weren't there to help lead them to God. Or, there might be your kids who, since you didn't take the wager, don't become Christian, and they become moral nihilists and skeptics. Okay, I mean, you're a lot more I don't know too many Christian nihilists or skeptics. Statistically, you're a lot more likely to be a moral nihilist if you're an atheist. It's not a necessary connection, but it's more likely. So, I mean, wouldn't that be a terrible thing if my son grew up to think that there is no such thing as moral wrong and was just a jerk about how he lived his life? So, I mean, the point is that there are huge negatives on both sides. And if you think it's 50-50, you think, yeah, there are risks on both sides, and you just have to ask what the greater risk is. And I would argue that the greater risks, I mean, if Christianity is true, the values there just swamp the other stuff because you're dealing with eternal destiny.
Yeah, maybe an analogy would help. Maybe it would be like something like this. It would be, I'm going to flip a coin, and you have to call heads or tails. If you call heads, then you will die a tragic death. If you call tails, then you may well, let me see. If you call tails, I always do this on the spot. If you call tails, you might have an even worse death, something like that, eventually.
Okay. So two bad things, but tails is worse.
Yeah, but tails is worse. In that kind of case, you're going to pick the one that's the least bad for you.
Yeah. Right. There's a tendency to think, well, it's the wagerer who's wagering for Christianity, which is taking on all these risks. Why don't they just do the default thing and remain agnostic and just live a normal life? But in fact, I think the normal life involves great risks as well. If you and you should think that if you think there's a 50% chance of higher that Christianity is true, then by not pursuing God, you're opening yourself up to all sorts of non-rational influences, which are going to sort of lead you away from God, and that incurs huge risks for yourself and those you're close to.
Okay, two more questions if you have time. One's from Andrew Moon and one's from me. Okay. So the one from Andrew Moon is about Peter Van Inwagen's defense, expanded free will defense. So he wants to know, let me find that comment. I had it pulled up. Is there any empirical evidence behind Peter Van Inwagen's claim that suffering helps people turn to God? That would add some plausibility to his defense. It seems that suffering turns some away from God.
Yeah, great question. This is relevant to Eleanor Stump's defense as well. What she argues is that suffering is the best available means to give a person an opportunity. What suffering does is give you an opportunity to focus your life on the right goods. So she says suffering gives you an opportunity to ward off the worst thing for humans, which is eternal separation from God, and to achieve the best thing, which is union with God. And she tries to give some empirical evidence in one of the later chapters of her book, and it has to do with the psychological literature on post-traumatic growth, or what's it called? Adversarial.
I've listened to a lecture from her where she discusses this. I can't remember the term, but you're right. It's
adversarial growth.
Okay.
Adversarial growth. Yeah. So yeah, there's a little literature. There's a scholar at Wake Forest named Aranda Jawick-Reme who's written on post-traumatic growth. And then Eleanor Stump gives just a nice little straight up philosophical argument, which makes it plausible that suffering would often help people grow. And it's this. Suffering, by definition, is adversive. It hurts, so we want to avoid it. If you exhaust all human means to get rid of the suffering and you fail, then what else is left to turn to? Well, supernatural means. So suffering that sticks around after you've tried to stop it with natural means, it's reasonable that people would try to turn to God for help. So yeah, that's what I have to say about that.
Okay. So Timothy Saunders wanted to follow up. He was the one that asked about the case where you say, hey, commit your life to Christ, and then this person goes off and maybe gets martyred. So he asked a clarification. He said, if the wager I'm sorry, that's the same one. He says, is it a negative to not take the wager and still get heaven? Dr. Rhoda, I believe, said non-Christians can still get to heaven.
Yeah. So I believe it's possible for a non-Christian to be saved. This is the Catholic doctrine of invincible ignorance. And the idea is if you're not a believer, but it's not your fault that you're not a believer, rather because of the circumstances of your youth or your life or what evidence you're exposed to, then it's possible you could be saved. So that sounds consistent with what a loving God would do. And I accept that doctrine. So yeah, I think just because you don't take the wager, you don't search for God, you still might make it. But two things. Clearly the probability is going to be less. And secondly, you're going to miss out on all this worldly benefits of religious belonging and religious commitment, of which there are many.
Yeah.
I mean, depending on your situation, I think many people will look at their situation and say, well, let me put it this way. For those of us who are already in religious communities, I mean, it's often fairly easy to say, my life would be much the worse if I weren't pursuing God. I guess a person who hasn't yet made that leap, it's not going to be evident to them. So there I would say, yeah, you might make it, but why take the risk? I mean, it's a huge risk.
Yeah.
No one would take that sort of risk look, people buy house insurance. I'm going to pay house insurance probably for 40 years and way more than any claim I'll ever. This is the probability that my house is going to burn down is very low. Most likely I might as well just be tearing up money, right? But it's still rational, because if my house does burn down, I need somewhere. I need help. I'll need help to get the money to rebuild it. So if people make sacrifices for things as mundane as house insurance, the idea of making sacrifices to raise the chance that you'd be with God forever. I mean, it just seems like a smart move.
Yeah. Those are two important points you made there, that by not taking the wager, you've automatically reduced your chances of making it to heaven. It's not like, oh, it's a guarantee I'll make it. You've dramatically reduced your chance. And the second point you said, and this was, to me, was the real one of the things I enjoyed most about your book, is you show through just all this literature, sociological, psychological, that there are real, tangible, this worldly benefits to a Christian commitment. It's not like our only positive thing would be whatever happens in the next life. No, there are many benefits here and now, and by not taking the wager, you're going to miss out on those. So, okay. Let me see. My last question was going to be a response that I got to the counter evidence video.
Okay.
Specifically, Peter Van Inwagen's his expanded free will defense. Somebody asked, on his scenario, God uses evolution to create these at least advanced primates, and then God miraculously gives them rationality, free will, and so on, and places them in this paradise. But they wanted to know, doesn't that just introduce more problems, because now this evolutionary process has utilized, now you've got all this other evil through the evolutionary process to explain. So how do you go about answering that?
Okay, so I think this is a question about the problem of animal suffering, which is this is another strong argument against the Christian worldview. The idea is here, if we accept what science, accept the scientific evidence, then we believe that animals were around long before humans came on the scene, and that there was a lot of predation and death and pain for many animals, right? So that some people think, why would God have done that? Like, wouldn't he have just created animals in a way that didn't have to involve all this suffering? So this is the problem of animal suffering. Peter Van Inwagen actually has a chapter on that question in his book, The Problem of Evil. I have a paper on the subject in a book edited by Sarah Coakley and Martin Novak on, I think it's called God and Games or something. It's about game theory and religious belief. So what do I want to say about the problem of animal suffering? It's its own whole topic. And I'm not prepared at the minute to give an awesome answer to it. But I would suggest three resources. One is Michael Murray's book, Nature Red in Tooth and Claw. Another is my paper in that edited volume. It's published by Harvard University Press. I forget the title. And then there's other literature on it as well. Here's my own little pet solution. I'm not sure if it's the best solution out there, but here's one idea that occurs to me. Theists are already committed to saying, Christians are already committed to saying, God must have some really strong reason to remain hidden. I think it's to allow people to freely choose him for the right reasons, which would be difficult if we knew that his existence was as evident as the existence of this glass. Then we'd have strong pragmatic reasons to just toe the line, and that's not really what he wants. He wants a change in our hearts. So let's say you're already committed to the view that God has reasons to remain hidden. Now ask yourself, could he remain hidden if he had miraculously engineered the de novo special creation of all the animals, or if he miraculously intervened any time an animal was going to suffer? So my thought is that in order to preserve divine hiddenness, if God wants to do that, he may need to have sort of a more hands-off approach to creation. And so he may want to use the evolutionary process, although it involves pain. Because the thought is, if God just specially created all the animals, at some point in the development of human knowledge, it would become very apparent, and William Paley's watchmaker argument would just be like a slam dunk, and you'd say, no rational person can deny that God set this up here, or that some super powerful, intelligent being set this up, and so that would jeopardize divine hiddenness.
Okay. So that's interesting that the two kind of overlap at that point. Okay. Well, I appreciate all the time you spent answering questions. I'll stop there. But if you ever have the time and would like to come back on, I'd love to set up more discussions with you. So I really appreciate you taking this much time for me, and I'm going to try and get Dr. Rhoda to watch some more of my videos and then give me an honest review. I told him that I really tried hard to stick close to what he said, so I don't think I misrepresented him at any point. But hopefully, if he sees more of the videos, he might give me a little endorsement of some kind.
Oh, I can't say this, Jordan. The video I did watch, number 4, was superb, and I thought the graphics really helped in the explanation and the teaching. So I'm grateful to you for doing them.
Well, thank you. All right. Well, I will end the live stream there for today, and I've got a really, really cool project coming up this summer that I won't announce yet, but I'll be announcing that project soon. It involves a team of philosophers, so I'm really excited to begin this, and I'll announce the names and what the project is really, really soon. So thank you very much for watching, and have a good afternoon.